In my career as a 3D artist, I have completed over 150 projects and I have used a simple 5-step method to create over 100 realistic renders. If you stick until the end of this video, I will show you a rinse and repeat process which you can use to create realistic renders. No matter what project I'm doing, I always get started with 3D modeling. I'm not going to waste a lot of time in every single detail of it, but here's the broad aspect of it. I get started on modeling in ArchiCAD, where I do the modeling of raw parts, aka the walls, the slabs, the windows, the doors, etc. From there, I move on to SketchUp, where I add more details like furniture or accessories or anything else that might be needed. This last part needs a bit more attention because in order to import the right 3D models, you also have to understand what makes a 3D model look good. So here's what to consider. Scale is very important because you want to have the right size and dimensions, that way it doesn't look out of order with the dimensions of the actual room. You also have to take a look at how organic the 3D model is. Usually sharp edges are a red flag of if a model is actually high quality or not. Most of the objects in real life have round corners, like even this table right here, and this is how most objects are in real life anyway. So let's try to mimic that in our renders as well. The way that we can check this is by the amount of polygons a model has. Usually the higher the amount of polygons, the more organic the actual 3D model is. So here's what I do to find high quality models. If you go to the SketchUp warehouse and then go to filters, try to increase the minimum amount of polygons that the search results can have. Usually this means the results are going to be in higher quality or they're larger, but this gives you a better chance of having a good search result for 3D models. If you're using Enscape just like I am, usually the 3D assets that have been added to the asset library later on, so not in the beginning of the Enscape development, those ones are higher quality, so try to keep that in mind when you're trying to import 3D models from the Enscape asset library. This is pretty much my whole 3D modeling method and process. I've done it in multiple videos and even in an 8-hour live stream that I did a month ago, I think. Once we're done with this, we move on to the next step, which is where most people go wrong. After you're done with 3D modeling, you do not want to move straight to materials or lighting. I myself go to Enscape and set up the composition. Now this is very important as well, because the reason why I've been able to develop such a method for my renders to be so consistent is the software combination that I've been using as well, which is SketchUp and Enscape. From my experience, there is no better time to quality ratio that software can have. So setting up the composition this early is actually very crucial because this will allow you to not waste time on parts that are not going to be captured in your render. A few things that you have to watch out when you're doing the composition is to know exactly where your render is going to be used once it's finished. Will it be for social media, will it be for a portfolio, or will it be for a presentation or anything else like that? So each one of these scenarios have different kind of settings you have to use, aspect ratios, or even field of views. So here's my general guidelines of how I do it with the rinse and repeat process. If the render will be used for an Instagram post, I use a 4:5 aspect ratio. If used for PC presentation, use a 16:9 aspect ratio or a 1920x1080 resolution. And if used for stories, reels, or TikToks, you can use the opposite of the PC presentation, which is 9:16 aspect ratio. Once you set up all the composition, the aspect ratio, the field of view, and all of that, you are ready to move on to the next phase. Now, materials can be very tricky, and this is mainly because of how reliant the source of where you get the materials from is. I'm not affiliated by any of these sites, but for me, AmbientCG.com and TextureBox.com has always worked best for my projects. I always use a 2K resolution for my materials because that is good enough for most of my projects. And then as far as maps go, I obviously get the diffuse map or the color map, and then the displacement map and roughness map. This works perfectly fine for my projects, and I don't need that much more complication in order to get everything right with SketchUp and Enscape. This is easy to remember as long as you remember that all materials need some depth, which is what the displacement map provides, and all the materials need some reflections, which is what the roughness map provides. This usually works totally fine with most materials, but in order to add another level of realism, I usually add imperfections. In real life, as you have noticed, most materials are not perfect. They have scratches, dust, fingerprints, and stuff like that. This is very easy to implement in our own 3D rendering projects. You basically download an imperfection map online, and then you can just import it onto Enscape or whatever software software that you're using in the roughness map section. But make sure you isolate where the imperfection map is placed. That way it's not super exaggerated. My materials process is super simple, and as you can see, this is why it has worked so consistently for me until now. So let's move on to the next step, which honestly most of the time is not so set in stone because it can differ from project to project. So with any project that I'm working in with lighting, the first step is the same. For interiors, I always turn the sun intensity all the way down to 0, and for exteriors, I import an HDRI. So let's tackle the interior lighting first. So the first method is by adding spotlights in the outside, which are directed in the openings of the room, and I make the beam angle as large as possible. That way the shadows are soft. Now there's some instances where this type of lighting won't work, so I add a rectangular light source either right outside of the window or right inside of the window. This method is just as useful as the spotlights most of the time. Something else to keep in mind for the interior lighting is to always use IES profiles for your spotlights. You can find many useful IES profiles in ieslibrary.com. Once again, I'm not affiliated with the site, but basically what these IES files do is that they input the distribution that the spotlight has to something much more natural, which is based on real-world spotlights. So let's move on to exteriors. The first step, as I said, is to find a reliable HDRI. Now, once again, I'm not affiliated by this site, but polyhaven.com always seems to have what I need for HDRIs. If you do not know what an HDRI is, it's basically a 360 image taken in real world, which we can import into our 3D renderer to use as a light source. Trust me, it doesn't get much more realistic than using real world lighting sources. Just know that it can have a huge impact on how your renders look. Now, once you do this, make sure that you take the brightness point as sun direction in the settings and rotate it to a point where it actually creates enough depth, contrast, and in an angle that it just makes sense for the render. The fifth step is visual settings. Once you set everything up, it is time to look at color correction. This can highly depend on the type of project you have, what kind of materials have been used, what kind of colors those materials have, and what kind of lighting bounces in the interior or the exterior. However, I personally have a few rules of thumb. I use Enscape as my rendering engine, and I know for sure that the default saturation usually is too low, so I keep it anywhere between 105 to 110%. Another rule of thumb for me is to keep the sun intensity between 5 and 20% because the default sun is just way too strong. Also, I omit completely all of the effects except the vignette if I actually want to use it for making things more dramatic or even taking the attention away from some of the things that are on the side of the frame. So if you want to see me put this whole process into action, watch this video right here.